Okay, this is Survey of the Nonprofit Sector, Lecture 13, Philanthropy in Time and Place. The outline for this lecture: first we're going to do a little bit of introduction, then go over some Rawlsian principles, then we're going to do Rawls' theory of intergenerational justice. An important part of that is how we reproduce social capital, as well as the just savings principle and how it relates to foundations. Then we're going to end with looking at catastrophic and existential risks, and then a conclusion, and then a few things at the very end worth noting. So the main kind of topic or idea here is whether or when the state should support intergenerational transfers of private wealth for public benefit. So that is, if someone wants to set up a foundation with their own money for the benefit of the public or for the future, when could or should that work, or what roles should that take? One first is long enduring philanthropic institutions. They can reproduce social capital over time if they focus on a specific type of nonprofit organization. We're going to talk about that. Second is public transfers of wealth may not be sufficient to fulfill the requirements of intergenerational justice, and so we need to supplement it with private transfers. And then also, as we talked about previously, with short-termism or presentism, the current democratic process we do not look at long time horizons, and so this gives us another way to think about the interests of future generations who do not have a vote. So some of the important principles from John Rawls. The first is the just savings principle. So the main idea here is our main duty to our successors is to be able to maintain just institutions over time, and that they have the capital sufficient to maintain those just institutions. And by having just institutions, we increase the possibility that as many people as possible could have a worthwhile life and seek their own pursuit of happiness. The second principle worth noting, or that we need to know about, is the difference principle, which is that decisions cannot go against the best interests of the worst off members of society. So if we're thinking about doing something, the difference principle will suggest that we should not do it if it makes the worst off members worse. And then finally, the liberty principle: each person has an equal claim to a fully adequate scheme of equal basic rights and liberties. But these principles are not always congruent. Sometimes they're at odds with each other. So for Rawls, he says that securing the stability of just institutions over time, which will then give us the liberty principle, that has priority over the difference principle. That is, it's more important for us to have just institutions and institutions that protect our rights than it is for us to make sure the worst are well off. Not that that's not important, but the just savings principle is more important than the difference principle, and it is also constrained by the liberty principle. Okay, so what is Rawls' theory of intergenerational justice? It has two stages. First, until a society has created just institutions, each generation has a duty to transfer to the next one more capital than the amount inherited from the previous generation. So each generation gets a certain amount of capital from the previous generation, or resources. Until we've got to the point where we've created just institutions, we have to give to the next generation more capital so that they have more resources to create just institutions. At some point, when basic institutions are in place and we've protected liberties, our next obligation, or I guess our obligation to save, ceases, and so we just have to go into a preservation of the current capital. There may be some caveats, and we're going to talk about what those might be. So then the next question is, what type of capital do we need to transfer? I keep mentioning this word capital, or we need to transfer resources, but what types? Rawls clarifies it's not just economic or material capital. This could be cultural capital, this could be technology, it could be any kind of whatever thing we need to create just institutions and protect basic liberties, we should pass that on. And so with that in mind, Rawls emphasizes how important informal norms are, attitudes, and the things that we get from social capital. And so for him, social capital becomes maybe the most important type of capital we should transfer to the next generation. So how much do we need? It really just depends on each society's point in history and their circumstances. So, for example, if the next generation gets hit by a meteor, they're going to need more capital to maintain well-orderedness than the current generation. I think maybe a more prominent example we have now is the issue of climate change. The problem with climate change is not necessarily that the climate's going to change, it's sort of downstream effects of a climate change. We're going to have a lot of civil unrest. We're going to have a lot more issues with borders and how do we properly maintain or protect, or while also respecting human life. All of these are going to be huge issues probably for future generations, and so they're probably going to need more capital to create, preserve and create just institutions. So when we can foresee a burdened state coming in the future, it's probably reasonable that we can supplement this just savings principle with a principle of intergenerational assistance. So we should assist future generations by giving them more resources or more capital. So just a refresher on social capital, it can be individual or collective attitudes of trust, civicness, and reciprocity. This is generated by and embedded in cooperative activities and networks. And this is kind of the gas that fuels the engine for a well-working, democratic, liberal, constitutional society. The health of social institutions all runs on social capital underneath the hood. So it's this kind of secret sauce that makes everything work well. So if we go back to the just savings principle, the idea is we need to secure stability, stable institutions, just institutions over time. It means we need to secure and preserve the conditions that will reproduce social capital for future generations. Okay, then, so how do we reproduce and sustain social capital across generations? Reich makes the argument, I think there's some strength to this, that associational life in civil society, the voluntary and mediating associations that are different from the family, the market, or the government, is one of the primary sources, if not the primary source, of social capital in society. So we need to find a way to reproduce social capital for future generations, and the best way we know how is through civil society and voluntary associations. So again, it doesn't mean that we should impose that a certain type of association be used to generate social capital, because it may be different in the future. But we need to provide a way that future generation can generate the social capital it needs to create just institutions. So why not families? Again, families tend to be a little bit inward-looking. Their bonds are, like as we talked about, strong ties, where you may be in echo chambers, you're hearing a lot of the people in your family, but you may not be extending out beyond that. And so, again, the strength of weak ties is important for building social capital in society, building those weak ties among coworkers, among people in the community, where you have trust with them, not necessarily close bonded relationships, but you have bridges between a lot of different types of people in your network. So maybe families, while they are great in a lot of ways, building culture, preserving culture, it may not be the best way for a society to generate social capital. Not professional nonprofits. So we kind of mentioned earlier that there has been a noticed decline in civic engagement at the same time that formal professional nonprofit organizations has skyrocketed. So that may be a correlation. There may or may not be causation there, but these sort of informal associations where volunteers are working together, where you have grassroots movements of people working together. That type of organization or voluntary association builds social capital more than a professional nonprofit, because in a lot of ways, especially nonprofits that are funded based mostly on government grants, tend to act and look a lot like government agencies and lose that aspect that kind of builds social capital in society. So again, maybe the best way to reproduce social capital is not in the family, it's not in professional nonprofits, it's in voluntary associations. And then finally, not the state. There's a lot of reasons why the state may not be the best way for us to produce social capital. First, we need to maintain some financial and political independence between the state and associational life. Those mediating institutions between individuals and the state, in the middle there's those mediating institutions that are important to help us be protected from and independent from the state. The second reason we talked a lot about in this class is pluralism. The more a state funds nonprofits, the more we have, or the less pluralism we have, because it comes with strings attached, it comes with isomorphism. We don't have as many different types of organizations, or not only in the form they take, but also in the types of things they are addressing or the things they're interested in. And since we don't know what's going to solve the problems in society, maybe we should just try everything. And then finally, a funding system for voluntary association that relies entirely on the state, you might start to crowd out individual altruism or solidarity that people feel when they're working together on problems. Okay, so let's think about the just savings principle and the role of foundations. So if we follow Rawls' just saving principle, we sort of conclude that each generation should transfer as many philanthropic assets as it received from the previous one. So if we create a foundation to generate social capital for the future, what should the trustees of that next generation be required to do? They should be distributing it to civil society groups who help build social capital. They shouldn't be allowed to spend for unrelated goals, but at the same time, we should be so again, as we talked about earlier in class, we don't know what the problems are going to be in the future, so we shouldn't expect the future generations to only adhere to what we think is best and what our conceptions of good. So this is a bit tricky. We know we need to generate social capital. We know it's important for building and maintaining a society and a democracy. Yet at the same time, we don't know what the future is going to need. And so there's sort of a trick, a balance here. So once foundations have maybe met their intergenerational requirement to help, what should they do? Maybe we can now think about the difference principle and the worst off members of each generation. So once we've met the just savings principle, we should redirect whatever's left to improve the conditions of the current generation's worst off members. Okay, catastrophic risks. So we hinted at this at the beginning. There are some things that will come up in our lives potentially or in future generations that could have a catastrophic impact on our ability to have a civil society. We're able to kind of determine in statistical terms the probability of these events. Some of these are natural by nature, they are caused by nature. Some of these are man-made. You think about a nuclear holocaust, that is a catastrophic or potentially existential problem that we could create. So supposing we know the probability of these things, what should we do? Should we try to transfer more capital to the future generations so that they can deal with these catastrophes? So again, coming back to the just savings principle, we're obligated to pass on whatever we receive from the previous generation, but with the potential of catastrophes, we have a potential of regress and going back to the accumulation stage where we lose just institutions, where we don't have the institutions in society that can provide a place for everyone to seek happiness or have all the rights that they need. And so we might have a duty to maybe give more to the future. So how much should we give to future generations with the potential of catastrophes? So there's two issues here. The first is the potential magnitude of future catastrophes, and then the probability of future catastrophes. If we just think about the potential magnitude, some of these things we can consider are just so big that could just completely decimate society. And if that were the case, well, we should be saving everything to kind of ensure as much as we can that society stays civil in the future, even at the expense of the worst off members of our current generation. But that's not necessarily reasonable. It's hard to do that. And so maybe we should consider, okay, even if these have a potentially huge impact, we should maybe think about the probability and use the probability to kind of tamp down how much we think we should save for future generations. The thing with with catastrophes or these existential risks is that often these don't just affect our country. Many times these things affect everyone. And so with this in mind, a lot of nonprofits have started with the aim of reducing the risk of human extinction or reducing the problems associated with these catastrophes. This could be any number of things: climate change, bioterrorism, pandemics, a malicious artificial intelligence. And so again, in recent years, maybe the last 5 to 7 years, you've seen a growth of new nonprofits who are focused on reducing the risks of catastrophes or building up our potential ability to deal with some of these problems. One example, the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford, the Open Philanthropy Project in California, which is an offshoot of GiveWell, which we've talked about previously in this class. So conclusion, philanthropic institutions can play 3 important roles in helping a society fulfill its intergenerational obligations and thereby honor the just savings principle. First, they complement political institutions in securing and reproducing social capital over time. They supplement political institutions in helping us to not go back to an accumulation stage. And then third, they counteract short-termism, presentism of the democratic process in a way that promotes long-term interests of future generations. Okay, so kind of concluding a lot of Reich's thoughts. Some things he noticed, some things he wanted to address. He noticed that sometimes philanthropic assets are wasted. That seems bad. Other times, philanthropic assets have enormous effects in steering or changing public policy, and that can be worrisome because we're dealing with a plutocracy where only the rich have power. He does note, though, even though we have these problems, there is still a role for philanthropy. For ordinary donors, we want pluralism. We want as many ideas and things out there. And then second, for private foundations, the role of discovery, experimenting, trying to figure out how to solve problems, and we don't know the best way. And then finally, philanthropy can help us promote and help secure justice across generations. Okay, a few other things worth noting. We haven't mentioned much in class that are sort of new that we need to keep an eye on. Not a lot of work in the academic literature on what these things are or what their effects are, but I think they're important to know about. So the first is donor advised funds. So these were created by community foundations as a place for ordinary citizens to support or to donate to a charitable investment account. So think of this as like an endowment, but where a lot of people give to it. And so what we have is a community foundation. When you want to give, you can just give to the community foundation. They have a donor advised fund. That money becomes an endowment and is invested. It actually doesn't go to charity yet. and then slowly it starts to generate returns. This is growing. The largest recipient of charitable contributions in the U.S. for the past few years was not the United Way or Salvation Army or even Stanford, like a big university, but the Fidelity Charitable Gift Fund. In 2017, 6 of the top 10 recipients of charitable contributions were donor-advised funds. So now that we have this big open question, how should public policy treat donor-advised funds? Now, we can think about what Rice talked about with his political philosophy of foundations, right? Because donor-advised funds at their heart are basically just a type of foundation, but for a bunch of ordinary citizens. So maybe some of the same rules might apply, or maybe same philosophy might apply for donor-advised funds as a way to support future generations, as a way to support the the generation of social capital for the future, as a way to experiment and seek ways of what might help humanity the most. And then the second is limited liability companies. So limited liability companies have been around for a long time. This is one of the ways you can incorporate as a business. But what is important to note about these as it relates to nonprofits and philanthropy is that in recent years, a lot of very rich people have preferred to create limited liability companies rather than foundations. So the main example here is Mark Zuckerberg and his wife Priscilla. In 2015, they committed that they would spend 99% of their wealth to advance human potential. They didn't create a foundation though, they created a for-profit LLC. Other examples of this, the Emerson Collective, founded by Laurene Powell Jobs, which is Steve Jobs' widow. Omidyar Network, created by Pierre and Pam Omidyar. I don't know who they are. The Good Ventures, Dustin Moskovitz and Carrie Tuna, actually were some of the seed funding for GiveWell, I think. So what's important to know about LLCs, they avoid a lot of the already modest regulatory requirements that are attached to private foundations. So we talked about how private foundations aren't very accountable already. So LLCs are even less accountable. LLCs can also engage in charitable grant making. They can invest in startup companies, and they can direct their funds toward political advocacy and electioneering. That's also very important, right? Because as we noted, there are rules about 501c3s and how much they can advocate. So some of the same issues that we're worried about with foundations, we also have with LLCs. Now, an LLC is different in that it is not a 501c3, it is not a nonprofit organization. So any profit that this type gets, it is taxed as a normal business would be. So then the question is, how should we treat social change LLCs? If an LLC is just set up as the Zuckerberg LLC, that its sole goal is to advance human potential, but it's not a nonprofit, it's a for-profit, how do we deal with that? We just leave it be? Does some of the same political philosophy that Reich is setting out, does that then also apply to these types of social change LLCs? So again, donor advised funds and LLCs important, worth noting, kind of a new approach, 2 new approaches to doing good. And that's it. Thanks.